They laughed at you, didn't they? They said you were imagining things. They said you were too deep, too intense, too spiritual, too emotional. But what they really meant was you were seeing what they couldn't. You were stepping into a dimension they didn't have the courage to face. Because once you truly see the truth, you can never go back when people begin to call you crazy. It's often because your clarity has become unbearable to their confusion. You begin to see patterns they don't want to admit exist. You notice lies built into the foundations of what everyone else calls normal. You start asking questions that make people uncomfortable. And instead of facing the discomfort of their own blindness, they label you as the problem. It's easier to call you insane than to confront the possibility that you might be right. You see, history has always mocked its prophets. Every great revelation begins as heresy. Every truth bringer is first branded as delusional. When you disrupt the collective dream, you automatically become the villain in the story that the world has written for itself. Because truth doesn't arrive politely, it arrives like lightning, burning through comfort zones, shattering illusions, and demanding transformation. And transformation terrifies those who have built their security on deception. So they call you crazy because you threaten the order of their sleep. You challenge their comfort, and comfort hates confrontation. You mirror back to them everything they've refused to feel. That's why the crowd reacts with laughter, mockery, or silence. It's not because they've seen your insanity, it's because they've seen their own, and they can't bear it. But what they forget is that truth never seeks approval. Truth doesn't care who believes in it. The truth simply is. It existed before they named you, before they mocked you, before they judged you. And that same truth began to reveal itself to you when you reached your breaking point. When you cried out for meaning, when you were tired of pretending, when you dared to ask, what is real? That's when God stepped in, not in the thunder, not in the applause, but in the whisper, in the silence between your tears. In that moment when you realized that everything you were told to believe wasn't the whole picture. The truth you received wasn't a hallucination, it was revelation. You weren't losing your mind, you were finding your soul. Because awakening doesn't feel like light at first. It feels like fire. It burns away illusions you once depended on. It isolates you from people who can't yet understand. It leaves you standing alone, wondering if you've gone too far. But in that sacred isolation, something miraculous happens. You begin to see patterns where others see randomness. You begin to sense purpose where others see chaos. You begin to feel the pulse of divine intelligence moving beneath everything. That's not madness, that's perception. You're not losing touch with reality, you're gaining touch with a deeper one. The world calls you crazy because it doesn't have language for spiritual clarity. It only has categories, normal or insane. But the truth doesn't fit categories. It doesn't ask for permission to exist. It simply reveals itself to whoever dares to look beyond the mask of the world. The moment you stopped playing along, the moment you began to see with eyes that cut through pretense, that's when your exile began. And yet, exile is the beginning of mastery. You were meant to walk alone for a while. You were meant to be misunderstood. Because revelation without rejection is impossible. The truth must first offend before it transforms. So when they called you crazy, you were actually crossing the threshold between imitation and authenticity. Between living by the crowd's script and living by divine design, they thought you were breaking down, but you were breaking through. You were being stripped of false identities, false loyalties, false beliefs. Every accusation became proof that your vision was working. Every rejection became validation that your insight was too sharp for their comfort. God allows misunderstanding to protect you from premature influence. If they had understood you too early, they would have tried to own you, tame you, and reshape your message into something acceptable. But by calling you crazy, they accidentally preserved your originality. They gave you space to grow without their contamination. They handed you the gift of solitude where truth becomes unshakable. And one day, those same people who mocked you will look back and realize that what they called insanity was actually prophecy. That what they dismissed as delusion was divine instruction. That what they laughed at was the future knocking on the door of their denial. You were never crazy, you were just early, you were tuned to a higher frequency, hearing the whisper of God in a world that only listens to noise. And when that realization fully sinks in, you stop needing validation. You stop explaining yourself. You stop shrinking to fit the blindness of others. You simply walk with quiet certainty, knowing that what God revealed to you was not meant to be understood by everyone. It was meant to be carried by you. So hold your head high. You are not what they called you. You are what you discovered, an awakened soul in a sleeping world. And that, my friend, is not madness. That is divine sanity. Society survives by pretending it knows what it's doing. It needs the illusion of order, rules, routines, and rituals to keep itself from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. People find comfort in predictability. They want to believe the world is stable, safe, and under control. So when someone like you starts questioning that illusion, when you begin to speak truths that fracture their fragile peace, you don't just challenge their opinions, you threaten their entire psychological survival system. You become the mirror that shows them how much of their normal is built on denial. And denial for them is sacred. They guard it like a religion. They will defend their comfort even if it means attacking the truth. That's why when you begin to awaken, their first reaction isn't curiosity, it's hostility. They don't want to see, they want to stay asleep. Because seeing requires change, and change demands courage. Comfort requires nothing but numbness, so the word crazy becomes a shield. It's how they protect themselves from the discomfort of awakening. They don't say it because they hate you, they say it because they're terrified of the mirror you've become. If you're wrong, they can stay safe, but if you're right, their world begins to crumble, and so they must label, dismiss, and discredit you. It's psychological warfare disguised as social order. The irony is, every great leap in human progress began with someone's society called crazy. The innovators, the prophets, the revolutionaries, each one stood on the edge of reason as the masses screamed from their comfort zones. Because truth never fits into the shape of comfort. Truth destroys comfort. It forces you to confront the lies that keep you docile. It drags you out of mediocrity, out of collective hypnosis, out of the safety of conformity. The human mind craves ease. It doesn't want revelation. It wants reassurance. It doesn't want meaning. It wants distraction. That's why entire industries exist to keep people sedated. Entertainment, endless scrolling, false validation, synthetic joy. Comfort is the modern drug, and truth is the antidote nobody wants to swallow. When you start speaking the truth, you are introducing friction into that system. You're the spark in a room soaked in gasoline. You expose the cracks in the walls they built to keep out reality. You remind them that everything they rely on could fall apart in an instant. The job, the image, the reputation, the social approval. All of it is temporary scaffolding over existential emptiness. And when you point that out, they panic, because deep down they know you're right. But here's what you must understand. Their resistance is proof of your impact. When truth hits, it never lands softly. It breaks patterns, it rattles cages. It tears open wounds people have spent decades pretending don't exist. You're not rejected because you're wrong. You're rejected because you're effective. Comfort cannot coexist with clarity. The light of truth exposes too much. And yet, the ones who call you crazy are the same ones who cry out for meaning. They beg for purpose, for connection, for something real, but when it arrives, they flinch. They've grown addicted to illusions because illusions are easy to control. The truth has no leash. It demands surrender. It demands that people let go of what's false. And that's the hardest thing a human being can do. But you didn't come here to make them comfortable. You came here to awaken something. to remind them that life was never meant to be a padded room. You were sent to interrupt the hypnosis, even if it means being exiled by the crowd. You are not here to be liked, you're here to be true. Understand this: comfort and growth are enemies. Every time you choose truth over comfort, you evolve. Every time you choose comfort over truth, you decay. That's why the path of the awakened is lonely at first. You are walking away from what most people spend their lives protecting. But over time, that loneliness becomes strength. It sharpens you, it strips away illusions, it gives you eyes that no longer need validation to see. They will call you extreme, obsessive, detached, or delusional, but in reality, you've simply stopped pretending. You've stopped worshipping the false gods of appearance, success, and popularity. You've remembered something ancient, that truth is the only real ground worth standing on. And one day, when the illusions they clung to begin to crack under their own weight, they'll look back and realize you weren't the crazy one, you were the warning. You were the one who saw the storm before it arrived. You were the one who refused to build your life on lies. So when they call you crazy, don't argue, don't defend, just smile, because their words are proof that your awakening is working. You are threatening the illusion, and that means you're finally living in reality. Before you rise, you must be set apart. Before you understand the divine, you must first be misunderstood by the world. This is the painful paradox of revelation. Its first gift is loneliness. Because when God begins to reveal truth to you, it isn't a reward wrapped in light. It's an invitation into a kind of darkness that most people are too afraid to enter. It's the moment when everything you thought you knew begins to fracture. You stop fitting into rooms that once felt comfortable. Conversations start sounding hollow. The laughter of the crowd suddenly feels foreign. You're surrounded by people, but you feel unseen because the wavelength of your soul has shifted, and theirs hasn't caught up yet. That's what divine revelation does. It separates before it elevates. It pulls you out of the noise so you can hear the whisper. It breaks your attachments so you can hold truth without distortion. It strips you of dependence so that when you finally stand, you stand on something eternal. But to the world, that process looks like isolation, madness, or loss. They see your silence as withdrawal, your transformation as arrogance, your new perspective as rebellion. They don't understand that revelation is a sacred form of dismantling. God removes the scaffolding before he builds the foundation. This is why those who are chosen often walk through seasons of brutal solitude. It's not punishment, it's purification. It's God removing the opinions, the noise, the validation that once defined you, so that truth can define you instead. You can't carry revelation while still clinging to acceptance. The two cannot coexist. Acceptance wants you to conform. Revelation wants you to awaken. One will keep you loved by people. The other will align you with purpose. And every chosen one must decide which voice they'll obey. When you begin to see beyond the surface, you no longer belong to the surface. The world of shallow pleasures, gossip, comparison, and imitation starts to lose its flavor. You crave depth, meaning, authenticity, but depth is a lonely country. Few people travel there willingly. Most only visit when life collapses around them. You, however, were pulled there early. You didn't volunteer for solitude. It came to you when the veil lifted. And in that isolation, you learned something sacred. That peace isn't found in company, it's found in clarity. There comes a moment when you realize that being alone with truth is more fulfilling than being surrounded by lies. That moment marks the true beginning of your elevation, because revelation doesn't raise you by lifting your ego. It raises you by dismantling it. It doesn't inflate your identity. It purifies it until only the authentic remains, and that purification hurts. You lose relationships, opportunities, and approval. You watch people walk away, unable to understand your transformation. But those losses are not failures, they are alignments. Every departure clears the space for what's real to arrive. The divine isolates you because he knows noise dilutes instruction. He separates you from the crowd because clarity cannot coexist with chaos. Think about every great figure in history who carried a message from beyond. Their story always begins in isolation. The wilderness, the desert, the mountain, the prison cell, the quiet room at 3 a.m., that's where revelation descends. That's where strength is born. You are not being abandoned, you are being recalibrated. The world says loneliness is a sign of failure. God says it's the seed of transformation. When you are isolated, you finally stop performing. You stop seeking approval. You stop pretending to be who you were before the truth found you. You start listening to the deeper voice, the one that speaks without words, the one that doesn't need applause to be certain. That's divine intimacy. That's where revelation becomes relationship. And once you've lived there, even for a moment, you can never go back to blindness. You've tasted reality unfiltered, and nothing else satisfies. That's why the chosen often walk alone, not because they're superior, but because their vision demands silence. You can't explain divine patterns to those who only see surfaces. You can't teach inner sight to those addicted to distraction. So you walk alone, not as a victim of separation, but as a steward of clarity. Over time, your isolation transforms. What felt like exile becomes sanctuary. What felt like emptiness becomes peace. The same silence that once frightened you becomes the voice of guidance. And when you've learned what you were meant to learn in solitude, God begins to lift you, not for applause, but for purpose. The elevation comes quietly, naturally, because now your strength is real. It's not built on validation, it's built on revelation. So when you feel alone, remember this: the distance between you and the world is the space where God is forming something unshakable. You are being prepared, not punished. You are being refined for something that can't be built in crowds. The loneliness you feel now is proof that you are being entrusted with something others aren't ready for yet. Divine revelation isolates you before it elevates you, because only those who have walked through silence can speak truth that shakes the world. The world romanticizes enlightenment. People think that once you gain spiritual insight, life becomes calm, effortless, and filled with divine peace. But that's a misunderstanding born from distance. True spiritual awakening isn't a vacation from suffering, it's a direct confrontation with it. When you begin to really see, the nature of this world, you don't feel euphoric at first, you feel heavy, because you finally recognize the layers of illusion people build their lives upon. The lies, the fear, the manipulation, the blindness, and you realize how much of it you once called normal. Spiritual insight is not a trophy, it's a cross. It's the ability to see through appearances and understand what most refuse to acknowledge. It's the pain of clarity. You begin to sense motives behind words, energies behind actions, and truths behind masks. You start noticing the moral decay hidden beneath civility. You recognize the hunger for validation that drives people's cruelty, the emptiness disguised as confidence, the pain that hides behind laughter. And it's almost unbearable because you can't unsee it once your eyes are open. The burden of insight is that it doesn't allow you to return to ignorance. You can't go back to simple conversations or shallow pursuits. You can't be entertained by what used to distract you. You find yourself grieving for a world that celebrates its own blindness. You see people destroying themselves, chasing illusions, worshipping what is hollow, and your heart aches because you know where it leads. But you also know that you can't save everyone. That's the hardest part. Insight separates you not because it makes you better, but because it makes you responsible. You start to understand that every word, every thought, every choice ripples into eternity. You can no longer pretend your actions are insignificant. You feel the weight of consequence, the gravity of truth. You become aware that your silence, your passivity, your fear, all of it has impact. And that realization forces you to live differently. It forces you to become accountable in a way the world resists. That's the burden of the chosen, to carry light in a world addicted to shadows, to hold wisdom when ignorance feels safer, to walk with compassion in places where cruelty has become culture. It's not glamorous, it's exhausting, because your insight compels you to see both the beauty and the brokenness in everything. You see divine design in chaos, but you also see the suffering that comes from human blindness. You see both God's fingerprints and mankind's fingerprints, and sometimes they overlap in painful ways. You begin to understand why many reject awakening. It's simply too heavy, it demands too much, it requires you to feel deeply in a world that has trained itself not to feel at all. It calls you to stay awake while others dream of comfort, and yet, even in its weight, there's sacredness. Because, while insight breaks your illusions, it also rebuilds your integrity. It reshapes your purpose. It gives you vision that cuts through deception, and strength that outlasts approval. You begin to live with an inner compass that no one else can see. You start obeying truths that make no sense to those who haven't walked your path. You learn to move when God whispers, even if logic protests. You begin to trust divine timing more than social validation. And in that obedience, you discover that the burden of insight is also the birthplace of peace, not the fragile peace of ignorance, but the fierce peace of understanding. You carry knowledge of what matters. You stop chasing what fades. You no longer seek revenge because you understand karma. You no longer crave validation because you understand identity. You no longer fear endings because you understand transformation. Insight becomes your armor. It doesn't protect you from pain, but it makes pain meaningful. It doesn't make life easier, but it makes it sacred. This is why God doesn't give deep insight to everyone. He gives it to those strong enough to carry it. Because the truth, in its raw form, is not gentle. It burns away falsehood. It dismantles ego. It exposes wounds that must be healed. Many people aren't ready for that, but you were. That's why you were chosen. Your tears are not signs of weakness. They're proof that you're still human while carrying divine knowledge. Your heaviness isn't failure. It's evidence that you're holding light in a world that fears illumination. You are not broken. You are burdened with sacred awareness, and when that burden feels too heavy, remember, you were not chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because you were willing. God saw that you could hold what others would drop. He saw that your heart, though scarred, could still carry compassion. That your spirit, though tested, could still speak truth. And so He entrusted you with sight. Spiritual insight isn't a reward. It's a responsibility. It's the call to carry truth through darkness without losing hope. And though it feels like a burden now, one day you'll understand. It was never meant to crush you. It was meant to crown you. Truth has a strange rhythm. It begins in silence, grows in resistance, and ends in revelation. When it first finds you, it doesn't come with applause. It comes with rejection, because the truth doesn't enter the world through comfort. It enters through conflict. It unsettles before it liberates. And the moment you become a vessel for truth, the lies around you begin to tremble. That's why your awakening has drawn so much opposition. It's not personal, it's spiritual. You represent the fracture line where illusion begins to collapse. At first, it's invisible. You walk into a room and the atmosphere shifts. People who once celebrated you start to distance themselves. Conversations feel forced, friendships feel fragile, and the world that once fit you begins to reject you. But this is not because you've changed into something wrong. It's because you've evolved into something real. You now carry an energy that exposes what others are still hiding behind. The truth you embody acts like a mirror, and mirrors make liars uncomfortable. Every time you speak with honesty, you interrupt their performance. Every time you move with authenticity, you dismantle the collective mask. The world around you runs on image, on illusion, on comfort. People build their identities from what's popular, not what's true. So when someone walks in carrying a light that cannot be bought, branded, or controlled, it disrupts everything. You become the living contradiction of their entire system. And systems built on lies must defend themselves. They do so through mockery, slander, or silence. But the truth doesn't need their permission to endure. It simply waits. Lies are loud because they know they're temporary. They scream for validation because they know their time is short. Truth, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't beg to be seen, it just is. It moves slowly, like water carving through stone. It waits as the false structures of the world begin to collapse under their own weight, and when they do, the truth you carry will rise, not because you forced it, but because it was inevitable. You may not realize it now, but every attack against you, every misunderstanding, every rejection, they're all part of the unveiling. When people try to destroy you for speaking truth, they end up exposing themselves. When they twist your words, they reveal their own insecurity. When they attempt to silence you, they amplify your message. This is the paradox of divine truth. It cannot be buried without resurrection. The truth you carry is not just intellectual, it's energetic. It's woven into your presence, your tone, your actions. You carry the vibration of what is real in a world addicted to performance. That's why you unsettle people without even trying. You remind them of their forgotten integrity. You awaken the guilt they've buried under convenience. You trigger the conscience they've silenced for years, and yet you're not here to judge them. You're here to reveal them. One day, the same world that dismissed you will come searching for what you tried to give them. They will reach for the wisdom they once mocked. They'll quote the truths they once ridiculed. Because time is the great equalizer. It strips away illusions until only essence remains. And when the illusions of this era begin to crumble, the voices of the awakened will become the only ones that make sense. This is why you must stay steady. Don't let their doubt poison your conviction. Don't let their mockery infect your purpose. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be remembered when the storm clears. You are part of the divine correction, the great unveiling, the moment when what was hidden becomes undeniable. Every truth carrier throughout history faced the same resistance, but they also left the same legacy. The world always catches up, just later than the brave ones who saw first. Remember this, lies depend on fear to survive. Truth depends on nothing. That's why the world fights so hard to make you afraid. Fear keeps people loyal to illusions. But the moment you stop fearing rejection, truth becomes unstoppable. When you no longer crave their approval, their system loses control over you. That's when the revelation truly begins, so hold the truth gently but fiercely. Don't water it down to make it digestible. Don't hide it to make yourself likable. The same light that exposes their lies will one day guide their recovery. They may not see it now, but your courage to speak will become the blueprint for their freedom. You are the living evidence that truth doesn't die. It only waits for time to prove it right. When that day comes, and it will, they'll remember the one they called crazy. They'll remember the warnings they ignored, the words they mocked, the insight they feared. And in that moment, when the illusions finally fall, the truth you carried will stand untouched. It will shine, not because you demanded attention, but because God built it into you as a force the world could not erase. You don't need to fight for recognition. You just need to stand firm. Lies have an expiration date. Truth is eternal, and you, the one who carried it when it was unpopular, will one day be the proof that faith in the unseen was never foolish, it was prophetic.